to them.
This is the most extraordinary public health challenge,
as well as to everyone else, not just to my family,
that we have faced in 100 years.
Economic, social and cultural rights are also very important.
Especially this year, it's really an opportunity where we're all in the same storm. We might be in different boats.
These conversations are so important to promote the concept of togetherness, cross-cultural collaboration and of breaking down barriers that might otherwise, but should never, exist.
Really putting yourself out there in the university spaces.
That we can't use ethnicity or race
and utilising the online spaces that are provided for you
or religion as anchor points to be able to divide us.
Positive peace is an indication of a capacity of a country to be peaceful.
Well, there is an economic need for why we need to have a CEO who is Indian or Chinese.
There's only limited time in the day to be able to study and balance these other things.
But there is a moral case of saying, why not?
Crucial for your professional development.
We're yet to see culturally diverse representation at senior levels.
All the webinars that you saw, episodes or parts of there, are on the Affinity YouTube page. So please check that out. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce you to tonight's facilitator, John Cleary, a very valuable member of the Affinity's Advisory Board and a dear friend. John is a veteran ABC broadcaster and one of Australia's best-known commentators on religion. In his 30-year career with the ABC, he has worked extensively in both radio and television, but is principally known for his association with Sunday Nights, a program on ABC Radio National, local radio, and the Religion Report on ABC Radio National. John began his career in Perth, where he was one of the original Compass team on ABC TV and a co-presenter of the philosopher program Meridian on Radio National in the 90s. For several years, John also appeared in a regular slot on the ABC Youth Network Triple J. His 1992 book on the Salvation Army in Australia was awarded the Christian Book of the Year. In 2008, John was the host of the Interfaith event held by the Catholic Church in conjunction with World Youth Day and the visit of Pope Benedict the 16th. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Kathy. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. As most of us are aware, over the past few years, debates over social issues from gay marriage to LGBT rights and even education and sport have raised concerns about religious freedom. In 2017, the government appointed the Honourable Philip Ruddock to chair a review of religious freedom in Australia. Well, that review resulted in proposals for a new Commonwealth legislation, which is the subject of continuing public discussion. We have also seen proposals for similar legislation from the Government of New South Wales. Well, I should say from the Parliament of New South Wales. Beneath all this tumult and shouting, what these discussions reveal is a rather more complex web of issues that go to the very nature of our rapidly changing civil system. As formal religious adherence in Australia both diversifies and declines, is there a need for a deeper conversation? Well, joining us tonight to discuss their recently published books, it's my pleasure to welcome Robert Forsyth and Joel Harrison. The Right Reverend Robert Forsyth was the Bishop of South Sydney, the Anglican Bishop of South Sydney from 2000 to 2015. Before this, he was known to all as the Rector of St Barnabas Broadway and chaplain to the University of Sydney. Robert gave the 2001 Acton Lecture and has been awarded the Alan McGregor Fellowship at Concilium in 2010. Robert's been extensively involved in the areas of religious freedom and public policy, and he's currently a Fellow of the Centre for Independent Studies. And the editor, along with Peter Curti, of Forgotten Freedom No More, Protecting Religious Liberty in Australia. Dr. Joel Harrison is a senior lecturer at Sydney Law School, University of Sydney, and he teaches in areas of public and constitutional law and writes on religious liberty, constitutionalism, and law and theology. He's the author of Post-Liberal Religious Liberty, Forming Communities of Charity. And Dr. Harrison has taught at the University of Oxford, Columbia University, Macquarie University, and is a graduate of the University of Auckland and the University of Oxford. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, John.
Well, Bishop Robert, let me come to you first. The very title of your book is indicative of the dilemmas on this issue. Forgotten freedom? No more. Freedom of religion was simply taken for granted in Australia, shoved in a bottom drawer and forgotten about. It appears it can no longer be so because much else hangs upon its underlying principles.
That's true, John.
Your comments?
It was taken for granted because there is no positive right of religious freedom. It was merely a space in which it was allowed to happen. And massive social change in the last 30, 40 years has meant the shape of Australia has changed. In particular, the matter of the two big changes have occurred to make it harder. One is there's been the decline of religion practices, but that's not the issue. There's been a massive change in people's belief about sexual ethics in a way that have left religious communities as what I call recalcitrant minorities. Once upon a time, religious views about sex in particular were taken for granted mainstream views. Now they are particular minority views. Second thing is the rise of anti-discrimination laws and other positive laws, which creates a situation in which will our society allow these recalcitrant minorities to exist, or will anti-discrimination law and other laws rule them out of, well, threaten their existence by forcing them to adopt such practices that will destroy their communities. It's as strong as that. There's no real, the dangers now are quite, religious freedom is vulnerable, not under direct attack, but it's an alarming situation we're facing. That's why we wrote the book, a whole range of different views, not all consistent with each other, but drawing attention to the issue so it can be mainstream for the mainstream now. Forgotten freedom no more.
Robert, thank you for that outline. We'll get into some of those details in just a few moments.
Sure.
Joel Harrison, you suggest this discussion extends broader and perhaps even deeper than that outlined by Robert, that the liberal Enlightenment priority placed on individual freedom, on which much of our current philosophy in this area is based, may be inadequate for our increasingly complex society. Why?
Thanks, John. So perhaps the most important or substantive question in religious liberty conversations is, what is religious liberty for? Why should we care about it at all? And you've mentioned liberal Enlightenment theories of individual freedom. Well, this was underpinned at first by an understanding of a focus on freedom of religion. But then the question becomes, well, what are we really concerned with there? And so some writers will start talking about conscience. We're not really concerned about a particular category of religion, but maybe conscience. And then later, as this tradition keeps on going, different writers will talk about, well, it's not just about conscience, actually, it's about individual authenticity, for example. And underlying that is a notion of personal autonomy, right? So really, we're not talking about freedom of religion anymore, we're talking about the freedom of ethical freedom or personal autonomy. And so that then raises the question, well, why care about religion specifically? Why not just a broader conception of ethical freedom? And so you get some theorists talking about, and then you get this question in courts as well. You'll get someone like Ronald Dworkin will say, well, is there really any difference between the Native American who ingests peyote as a form of sacrament and the libertarian drug taker who just takes it for a matter of lifestyle? Or you get another theorist like Cecile Laborde will say, well, maybe having a really deep attachment to your sports team is similar to having this attachment to a religious community, right? And that's then you get questions like, well, why should we really be concerned about conscientious objection to, say, abortion or medical procedures that have traditionally religious people may have objected to? why should we care about their personal autonomy when we're not focusing on everyone else's personal autonomy? Or why should we provide an exception for those people when everybody must be regulated? Everybody's personal autonomy must be regulated by the same laws. And so in this way, ironically, this focus on the liberal tradition on religious liberty then begins to exhaust itself, because religious people are seen as equal, the same as all other people, all other instances of personal autonomy. So in my book, I try and then rethink the origins and the meaning and the purpose of religious liberty around more of an understanding of how do we build a community of communities? How do we cohere as a society that is formed by different communities that are nevertheless pursuing shared goals and even a religious quest?
That raises all sorts of questions which we will explore in a moment. Let me throw both of your positions into an immediate context that's outside of Australia, but we've seen how questions of religious liberty are foundational to another country, thankfully at this moment, and the issue facing the world, COVID-19. Just this week, the Supreme Court in the United States overturned a restriction placed on attendance at religious services during COVID-19. It was made in the context of the United States constitutional guarantees of freedom of religion, of course, but it overturned previous rulings which seemed to allow the public good to override absolute religious freedoms. Now, I'll get both of you to give us some observations on this. Do you think it was a good thing that the United States Supreme Court overturned the previous position and has now said, no, it's religious freedom is an absolute? Robert, first.
Look, I've no idea whether it's good or not. I don't understand the American system that well. I do know that in our country there is no right to religious freedom enshrined in law at all. So a situation wouldn't occur. However, if we go to what I think is still a benchmark of religious freedom, which is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights from the UN, it says this: everyone shall have the right to religious freedom of thought, conscience and religion, and so forth. Then it says, freedom to manifest one's religion may be subject only to such limitations as are prescribed by law and are necessary to provide public safety, order, health, or morals, or the fundamental rights and freedom of others. That is, if we use that, and I still think that's a good benchmark for discussion, people have a right, but it can be subject to limitations that need to be necessary and lawful. And I think if in Australia that's a situation, anywhere, I'm not arguing for absolute religious freedom, and I don't think that's a bogeyman. The question is, in Australia, are the limitations now necessary, and are they genuinely prescribed by law?
Joel.
So, John, I think your characterization of the case is we just need to nuance that a bit. So it doesn't overturn previous decisions. The previous decision you're referring to was one in the 1990s that sort of revolutionized First Amendment law in the United States, where basically the court said the legislature can have a general law, say nobody can partake in these drugs, for example. And even though that disparately impacted Native Americans, that was permissible, right? That's still the law. What this decision was about was within that doctrine, the American court has said you can't treat religious groups disparately. You can't treat them unequally to other groups. And in this case, they said the New York law was doing that. So this is interesting, I think, because it really does raise a question in the Australian context as well. So what do I mean by disparate treatment? I mean, if you stop people from going to the movie theater, if you allow people to go to the movie theater, you can't then say, but you can't go to your house of worship. If you say, we allow 60,000 people to go to a sports stadium and barrack for their team and scream at the top of their lungs, but then we also prohibit churches from singing, right? We have a certain arbitrary disparate treatment going on. And that's actually what the Supreme Court was focusing on there, the unequal treatment of religious groups within that New York law in a 5-4 decision. Now, that's interesting in the Australian context, of course, because it's only today that, for example, in New South Wales, there has been a change to allow religious communities to actually, Christian communities to sing at Christmas, right? And to do so with the encouragement of masks, right? Now, the argument has been, and I think it's been a very good one, I go to a church out in Hunters Hill, and if we walk out of that church and there are 20 people, that's permissible. If one more person joined us for most of this period, making 21 people, our rector would have had to disperse us. But we could have dispersed to the cafe across the road and sat there, or the pub across the road. And while we couldn't sing in church, we could go down to the pub and sing Happy Birthday, or, I Will Walk 10,000 Miles, or whatever song we want to sing. Right now, that's instances of disparate treatment, arguably. And that's actually what the Supreme Court is getting at, as a subset of the doctrine of religious liberty, that you treat religious groups at least equally. You can't arbitrarily isolate them for particular detrimental treatment.
Okay, well, given that, we've got a different legal system that's developed within the context of separation of church and state in Australia that's not as clear-cut as the United States. But in the Australian context, are there any threshold issues that are proving problematic in the current debate over religious freedom legislation? Robert, to you first.
What do you mean by threshold debates, John? Explain what you're looking for.
We've been debating this now. We've had the worthy persons sort of discussing religious freedom for a year or so. Then we've had a first draft of legislation in front of the people, and that's knocked back. There's now a second draft of 3 bills, I think, proposed. Are there any foundational issues for you in this raft of discussions?
Yes, look, basically, one of the troubles with the discussion of religious freedom, it's often been understood in basically liberal Protestant terms, because that's where the issue arose of religious freedom, and therefore thinks it's just about belief. You can believe what you like. But religious freedom is much more than just believing. It's what the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights calls manifesting. It's another nice phrase. In individual or in community. And one of the great issues is religious communities. And religious communities, to exist, require the ability to to teach their doctrine and to select their leadership and their members according to their criteria. In the modern Australian world, their criteria are not the same criteria that many others hold. In fact, some would regard their criteria as immoral criteria. That is, they would select on particularly sexual behaviour and sexual focus. And therefore, if the Australian society, in the name of diversity and inclusion, imposes restrictions on religious communities to protect liberty and diversity, the danger is they prevent them from existing, because they force Christian, Muslim, Jewish and other communities to no longer have the freedom to be the kind of communities they have. I don't think we're there yet, but I think that's a genuine danger. It's an existential danger to these bodies. And you see it in places like where they want to, Christian schools and communities can select and discrimination law, preventing them from discriminating against certain people except on very narrow grounds. And the more that happens, the harder it will be for these institutions and these communities to exist, because their morals and outlook is in contradiction to the mainstream view. We're dealing with how to handle what I call recalcitrant minorities. I saw it tonight on the drum before I joined you on ABC. There was discussion about the blessing of same-sex marriages. The drum, of course, completely all agree with each other massively, as we expect with that program, the ABC. No, seriously. And no one had any idea that for many religious organisations, the blessing of same-sex marriages is contrary to their deep doctrine. I'm not saying whether they're right or wrong. That's not the question tonight. The question is, should they be allowed to exist in this society?
And
that's the question.
You are clearly saying that yes, they should.
I think it would be a tragedy for our society if they were not allowed to exist. See, religious freedom is not for those you agree with. It's that even if you think religion is rubbish, I want people in Australia to be committed to the existence of religious freedom.
Now, how do you solve that dilemma in the context of the principles that you are building your case on? That is the 18th century Enlightenment traditions that have followed Locke and others.
You don't.
Well, I'm saying, well, can I say I'm very sympathetic to Joel's concerns. I agree. There are some real weaknesses in liberalism, and I'm interested in I'm very sympathetic to Joel's proposal. I'm saying, do you want a society which can tolerate as much pluralism as possible? That's the question, right? Or are you going to impose a narrow view of what's permissible? So if you want diverse Australia, you need diverse communities, which means you need to respect religion. And one last point. Religious communities are different from others or religious issues, because a person says, I'm doing this because I think God or the gods have told me. I don't think the state of Australia should have any view on whether God exists or not. But the possibility of an authority outside the state is what religious freedom guarantees. And I think by allowing people to have not just freedom of conscience, but the sense of transcendental authority is valuable for our society. So preserving religious freedom preserves the possibility there's an authority outside of the state, which is good for the state.
Well, yes, but that's a subjective assessment there. Joel, your observation too.
No, it's not. No, it's not a subjective. Just saying it's the allowing the possibility. Otherwise, the state becomes the sole arbiter of all that's good. It's not acknowledging the possibility of other authorities.
I think what Bishop Robert is saying is in part right. I think Bishop Robert is just confusing different rationales. So one where you're talking about even when you completely disagree, and you think religion is rubbish, well, that's a real problem. Why would we care about religious freedom at that point if we thought it was entirely rubbish, right? If it simply is just a matter of liberty on that conception, then you get into the argument, well, why this form of liberty? Especially when it's seen as a harmful expression to LGBT and so on and so forth, right? Yeah. But the idea that you're raising there later, when you're talking about, well, maybe religion is a good, and religion is directed towards something. So I remember the broadcaster Waleed Ali talking, about an existential urging, right? That was to obey, to submit oneself, and that has a more Islamic overtone to it, which I think is very fascinating, right? And then if you took it into a more Christian context as well, you'd talk about, well, it is about right relationship or with God or something like that, right? So actually there is a goal. There is a purpose to what you're pursuing. And that then leads to a sense that, well, you want to have autonomy for these groups and some relative autonomy for these groups because they are pursuing this understanding of human flourishing that, as Rob says, may in fact pose a challenge to the society at large. And so because it poses a challenge, it can't just simply be a delegate of the state. It just can't simply do exactly what the civil authority says and so on. There's a relationship between the two. There should be a relationship between the two, but still some sort of differentiation of that kind. Now, on your question, John, about what are the fault lines or what are the problems? I mean, Bishop Rob has he's highlighted the question of religious communities, especially around schools, for example. And that is a live question. There's also live questions around conscientious objection around healthcare. There have been interesting kind of cases that bubble away at the local level around groups that try to prohibit the building of mosques, which is just often done simply on an animus basis, to try and stop them from being built. There are, queries about whether there are rising levels of anti-Semitism sometimes. So there are these various things that sort of bubble away in the Australian context, I think. At the moment, we have, this question about whether it is permissible to, in traditionalist context, to counsel someone to remain chaste, right? If they are chaste in that traditionalist framing, in the context of their own sexual orientation and so on. You have the question around conversion therapy that's going on in Victoria at the moment. So we get all these different questions that are bubbling away. I think if I can take a step back to something that I think Rob alluded to as well, underlying a lot of this is a question of whether the wider public can still understand that there is in fact such a thing as a religious quest that may in fact lead to someone feeling a burden of conscience. And one of the major human rights groups in their submissions to the Ruddock Review started talking about conscientious objection to procedures like abortion as just sensitivities, just sensitivities of religious people, right? As though this was just kind of like an obtuse and odd thing for somebody to have as a feeling that fleets upon them and goes and so on. And another submission, another group did, they talked about how nuns had their right to family and their right to privacy and right to self-determination untimely ripped away from them, right? This was a breach of their human rights, that they were a nun. Right? Now, this seems to me to be a complete lack of understanding of religious communities. I mean, you take even the fact that it took this long to get to the point to say that singing in the church at Christmas might be an okay thing to do in a context of very little community transmission in Australia. Now, this seems to be, I think, the deeper problem, that there is a difficulty in some spheres to understand that actually some people see themselves as bound by part of these sort of rule-bound communities that are pursuing some understanding of human flourishing in relationship to God. And that actually may be part of our common public civic life.
The problem we're facing here, it seems to me, is an increasingly secular society. One of the arguments being heard more often is that the traditional justifications for religious freedoms to override other rights are simply past their use-by date. We're all secularists now and tough. You're just going to have to wear it. Robert.
What other rights are you talking about overriding?
Well, some of the illustrations we've already had.
Well, I mean,
where, for example,
if you want to have
yeah. No, go on.
Go ahead, John. No, I want an example might help
I defer to you.
The force of your question. My point is,
well, I mean Joel gave us a couple of the examples there, like teaching religious. What are the qualifications?
Can I say this? This shows the shallowness of our society. That is, Joel is entirely right what he says. I'm on his time. Where do they get these rights from? What's the authority of these rights? Who decides these rights? They're based on what? Where is the respect for those who believe in a of an authority from beyond and not just ourselves? A society that has no place to allow people to respect people, not to agree with them. I'm not asking for agreement. I'm asking for respect, not agreement, for those who believe they're behaving according to the will of God, is a tragedy for society. It becomes Albania. It becomes Soviet Russia. I mean, it has no respect for difference. It's a shallow sham of a society, and that's what we're in danger of having if we don't have the respect for the issues that Joel has mentioned. I'd like a society in which everyone was Christian, but of course that's absurd in truth. But I think a society in which people respect the possibility. The possibility only is needed, not the actuality of the supernatural, divine responsibility, and respect those who believe that's what they're doing. Anything less than that would be a tragedy, John, of a society. And I think that's not at stake today, but that's the danger long term.
Yeah, you then get presented with the argument, well, at the old saying, one man's meat is another man's poison. That is, what may be good for you can, in fact, if publicly declared and expressed, can materially damage someone else. And that argument's been running around in this community on this debate now for 5 years.
And you need that.
Joel.
You always need that. You always need something like that. So in adjudication and in political talk, we'll talk about dignity, for example. And there's large contests over what dignity means. But take the European Court of Human Rights, for example. They'll say that you can't even raise a claim. And the United Kingdom once suggested that if you had a religious group that was racially discriminatory, something like the Old South, right? That group would not be religious, he says, because religion requires dignity. This is the argument. And you always have something like that. And there's a question about how do you frame that? Who gets to invest meaning into that and so on. So I think that's always the case, what you're suggesting there, John. Now, your point about a secular society and so on, I think that's really interesting because we often assert that. People will say, well, we're secular and therefore, you can't have this or that or that. But it's more complicated to think about, well, what do we mean by secular? By secular, do we mean some sort of neutral space? Or by secular, do we mean simply a form of differentiation? Right? Differentiation in the sense that we don't have in Australia an official church, and we don't have an understanding then of like hierarchical authority, that the religious group is the civil authority as well. But that doesn't mean, though, secular authority doesn't mean that a civil authority should not be responsive to religious concerns, religious goods, and so on, right? That it should be actually attentive to those things. And in Australia, we actually have that, I think. We typically have had that. That's why we have had, since the dogs litigation and so on, we've had, public support of Catholic education and so on. That there is this sort of a generosity or liberality that takes place with respect to religious communities. That is quite an important thing to actually maintain, rather than trying to go down, sort of 1960s, 1970s American approaches of like strict separation and these sorts of things. That isn't our approach, really. And so what we mean by secular is quite important there. And nor does secular mean, I think, what some people think, that you can't have religious argument in public life. Some people say, you have to engage with secular reason, give secular answers. Well, that's sort of kind of goosing it a little bit, because it means then you can't actually make arguments about religious liberty in terms of, well, we're a community that's formed to try and pursue right relationship with God. Oh, no, we rule that out because, we've got to be secular around here. Again, I don't think that's actually our political traditions. Our political traditions have never excluded people in that sort of way, right? We engage in civil discourse and so on, but we don't tell someone, oh, you know what, when you make an argument based on Muslim texts, you've got to really try and wash them of all that religious malarkey in order to raise a different kind of argument. I don't think that's actually the way that we do our public discourse.
All sorts of games can be played with this. One goes back, you mentioned the dogs case, but you could go back to another example out of Victoria in the 1960s with the Scientology case, when the Victoria passed the Psychological Practices Act, which then caused Scientology to redefine itself as a religion, which changed its nature around the world. So this sort of gaming can be problematic.
And actually, that's a really good point. One of the dangers we have in Australia is that we increasingly juridify. We increasingly make this a matter for courts and law, right? And place it into that context. So you're precisely right. What you get often is you'll have a case in which, say, a group has to define its religious doctrines, and suddenly something that was marginal to the group becomes central. They have to, say X, Y, Z about sexuality now. They have to say X, Y, Z about gender, because the legislation and the court case demands it. So in your example, they now redefine themselves, right? So the law sort of leads us in peculiar ways. And I think there is a real need in Australia to try and maintain a certain sense of our own collective participation in this debate, that we come to collective agreements, collective commitments to, a question about how do we compose our different communities in our society.
Well, let's take a short break.
I think that's
yes.
I say what Joel's saying is that culture is more important than law. Even a lawyer saying that.
Let's take a little pause for the moment and hear a question from a video question from somebody who's got a vested interest in much of this discussion. It's a special video question from the head of one of Australia's largest religious communities.
Hi, I'm Deidre Palmer, President of the Uniting Church in Australia. Thank you for the opportunity to ask a question of the panel. In the Uniting Church, we view the right to religious freedom as an important element in the protection of all human rights. Fundamental to the Uniting Church's approach to its own religious freedoms is that such freedoms are never to be self-serving, but should be directed toward human flourishing within a healthy, diverse society. With that in mind, is it reasonable to hold people to account for the impact that their public theology has on the well-being of others? Thank you.
Robert.
I wish I could have more dialogue with that interesting question. But I take it the question doesn't mean legally hold to account, as if somehow you're responsible at law for your views. If you mean hold to account in the course of this discourse and discussion, of course, we're all to be held to account in the sense of you may disagree with me, you may challenge me, you may say my views are wrong, our views as a church. In that sense, yes. However, religious freedom is not to be just simply judged as freedom for people who do good, because I go back to an earlier comment about if you don't think religion is right, you still should at least acknowledge the possibility of religion and the value of having it in the society, even if you think you don't agree with it. And religious freedom occurs not just for nice religions or progressive religions that are aping the the progressive view of sexuality in the world, that's easy peasy for them. It's the religions that have difficult and lumpy views that are not the same as the society. They're the ones that really matter. They're the ones most likely to be damaged. Those who hold unfashionable views, and they're the ones, I think, who are most at danger in religious freedom. The denominations that fit in, that say Me Too to the sexual revolution, they've got no problem. It's those who are recalcitrant, Christian, non-Christian, will be the ones most in danger, and they're the ones we need to respect.
I guess it's the sort of argument that could be applied in the situation of Israel Folau speaking out as he did, or even Archbishop Fisher when he preaches from the pulpit.
Exactly. I mean, why? I'm still astounded. This is a classic example. Why the heck should what the Archbishop of Sydney says in the pulpit should be subject, unless he's insulting violence or hatred of others, which is contrary to the law? Why should that be a matter of anyone's concern? They may disagree with him, and they're allowed to say that strongly, but why should the law be involved? And why should the rugby union worry about a clumsy attempt to try and make some call to repentance on a bunch of sinners and turn it into what turned out to be a disaster for the rugby union, I'm pleased to say? But this is totally over-sensitivity. A little more Australian relax, have a fair go, and given, Australians are not supposed to be like that. I think a bit more easygoingness and just being more respectful of each other would avoid a lot of these problems.
Joel.
I think this is an interesting example where I love talking with Bishop Rob, because I sometimes feel like he gives me the sort of the liberal argument, and then I try and say, well, Rob, can we think more theologically for a moment? So
I love that.
So I think there is a kernel of something in the Reverend Palmer's comment. There's a kernel I wanted to pick up on, that your liberty, your freedom is for flourishing, is for human flourishing. Now, I think there's something quite deeply right about that, namely that in Christian thought, you don't think about liberty simply as a negative freedom, that my capacity for autonomy from other people, but actually true liberty is thought of as being truly good, right? Pursuing the right thing. So be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect, sort of thing, right? So it is when you are truly, Augustine talks about this, when you are truly free, when you are truly oriented towards the good, right? And there needs to be, now I want to analogize that to say religious liberty must be for something. It must be directed towards something. It must be directed towards something good. Now, that doesn't mean that every instance of somebody exercising religious practices are then judged by, as Rob was putting it, some progressive understanding of the good or something like this. In fact, I think it's possible to argue that groups that have a dissenting view on sexual orientation issues and so on, that they can still be understood as contributing to the goods of our society. I developed that in my book, right, and understanding that they're still participating in education, right relationship, and understanding of the virtue of relationships and so on. They just happen to do it in a different way, and so we could call it what I refer to as a displaced agreement between persons. But there should be some understanding that our liberty is for something good, for some understanding of flourishing. The second part of the Reverend Palmer's point, I think I'm largely in agreement with Bishop Forsyth there. The idea of being held to account is true in the sense that somebody can breach vilification laws, somebody could breach incitement to violence laws, somebody could be of those sort of nature. But if the suggestion is that, for example, a religious leader standing up in the temple, the mosque, or the church says, here's how I understand in a traditionalist reading of scripture, the holy texts, what right relationship is with the opposite sex. If that should be held to account, then I think that's quite a problematic intervention into what should be an autonomous space for those communities.
Here's the difference between Joel and I.
Yes.
He's ironic, and I love his point. Here's my problem. I wish that his views would carry weight in the society, because I think they're right views. Joel is right. However, when the same-sex marriage law was passed, many of the speeches regarded those who opposed the marriage of same-sex marriage as equivalent to those in America who wanted the blacks, the African Americans at the back of the bus. In other words, having no moral legitimacy at all. And we're in a time when many of the elite in our society regard those who hold minority views on sexuality and other matters as not legitimate. And this we saw, there's no respect at all. If you think you hold traditional marriage, you're not legitimate. You're the same as southern states segregationists in the 1960s. That's the society we're moving towards. And in that society, to expect people to think that's the argument has to be not, I wish Joel's argument did carry weight because that's the right one. I'm saying the argument might be, let's at least argue about diversity, because that may be something people understand. Because there's no respect. There's no respect amongst the elite in this country for religious views on sexuality. There's no respect on the ABC. There's no respect in the Parliament. That's our problem.
Look, I think
didn't you have? Oh, sorry, Joel. Yeah.
I was going to say, I think that I'm not. Look, whether we cast that as a net over all of Australia is a difficult question, I think, because what I think is true.
No, not all Australia.
And what I'm trying to say, on that point is that the idea that you'd use legal tools, say, to attack various groups and so on, is part of that juridification or that entering into court process that I think can be very counterproductive. And I think it can be counterproductive because what you now have in Australia is the increasing rise of complementary sort of NGOs that are waging a culture war against each other, right? And they have to get quite radical. Yes. These groups have to get radical. I'm talking about, religious groups, and I'm talking about, equality groups and so on, and various other groups. They have to get radical because what we have in Australia is multiple reviews, multiple iterations of bills, multiple this, and those groups then have to find supporters. So they have to start saying, look at these guys, they're really bad. Look at these guys, they're really bad, in order to generate their support on mutual sides, right? And so we get this conversation in which the heights of acrimony are sort of what are on display in our public life.
Yes.
When actually what we probably need to be doing is religious communities themselves need to be taking a bit more of the leadership of these issues and arguing from the space of, this is what we look like, this is what we do, this is what our worshiping community looks like, this is what our education space looks like. Come welcome and come see what we're about, and so on and so on, in order to say we're a constitutive part of public life, rather than these kind of bizarre sort of rise of these lobby groups that we're starting to see in this Australian case.
Joel, you're absolutely right. Where will the religious groups get this chance? Well, who will listen to them, right? Who will listen to them?
Well, Robin,
the public broadcaster won't listen to them. No one will listen to them. That's the trouble. That they are cut out from the elite, progressive media in this country will not listen to them. It's the case.
That may be true, Rob. That may be true. You'd also have to turn an internal criticism, and you could ask yourself a question like, how good is the Sydney diocese at doing this?
No,
well,
we're not
indeed.
good. We're
And
not
if you take the example,
you take
the example of the Sydney diocese for a minute. Let's go to the issue that some people do find deeply offensive because it impacts on all aspects of life, and that's the Sydney diocese's strong belief in male headship. Now,
your point so what's your point? What's your point?
Well, that is an example of something that many people would say that's like the Jim Crow attitudes of America,
of course,
the United States of America.
That's exactly my
South.
point. That's exactly my point. Exactly. That's my very point. It's illegitimate. It's not respected. No one thinks, and therefore it's regarded as not allowed. That's exactly the point. That's exactly my point.
But they would argue the converse is exactly the point. That is, what you are doing with the doctrine of male headship is implementing Jim Crow laws. You're saying, you're using the same language. You're saying separate but equal. And that's the language of apartheid. So,
well, in that case, we should not be allowed. In that case, we should not be allowed to exist. We should be outlawed. That's the conclusion you're drawing. Your conclusion is we are no better than the appalling racism of southern states. You say that, you're saying we should not be allowed to have those views. That's an appalling attitude. It's an attitude that I see held, John, by the elites in this country, especially the ABC.
Well, yeah, it's not those views, Rob. It's the manifestation of those views. To use
it's not about truth, it's about attitudes. You're saying that view is not acceptable in this society. the conclusion would be, if you held that view, it should be outlawed. And that's what will happen unless we have a liberal, generous society and allow difference. You must allow difference for those you
I think
agree
Rob's
with.
right that is what some people argue. They want to say it's analogous to racial segregation laws and so on. And then I think that's, and you have to look into why do these groups hold, why does a group hold this, why does a group hold a complementary view on marriage, for example? And I actually don't think the arguments are all the same. It's not as simply as saying, what you had anti-racial intermarriages, right? That argument was not the same argument as, well, we believe that the world is created with gender difference and so on, right? They're not on the same level, but you actually have to get into those. And there is too easy a conflation between, traditionalists who argue around gender differentiation, too easily conflated within questions of racism, I think, and so on. But my point about the Sydney diocese, which was a little bit of, wasn't so much about that. It was about, about how do we, as religious communities, how do you actually present yourself and welcome people into what you understand to be human flourishing and actually promote that and so on. It's not about necessarily having to have this hard reform agenda going on. It's about actually, do you come across to the rest of society as just simply someone who raises the persecution flag, for example, something like that?
Joel, that's a very good. They're very good questions. I belong to.
Joel,
however, I've not seen any interest, the slightest interest, from any of the elites in this society to find out why we hold the views we hold. It's taken for granted they're foolish.
Joel, let me extend the argument a little further. You suggest that an argument based on individual rights is flawed, in that it fails to recognise that human society has historically developed and continues to be shaped by essentially community. And I'll quote you here, what we have is a multiple decision-making structures and indeed forms of law and custom that nevertheless need to be reconciled. And they just state, as the European Court of Human Rights has strongly emphasised, there is a need to recognise the decisional autonomy of the church and like groups. Now, how can this possibly work in the Australian context?
Well, I think it already probably does in different ways. So we already have, an understanding that religious communities don't have to accept, they can base their leadership on their own doctrine. They can take members based on their own doctrine. That schools can hire still, or that's under pressure, schools can hire co-religionists. Training for ordination can be based on doctrines and so on. Some other forms of religious groups can operate based on their own understanding of doctrine. When I say doctrine, I mean that as, there's custom, law, and so on. And they, Anglican context, Roman Catholic context, Jewish context, they all engage in forms of law at the community level. Often that's recognized in statute. Sometimes it's recognized as simply arbitration, private matters, and so on. So we already have this sort of bubbling away of these multiple communities that are going on. And the real question to me there is, how do we then think about that as constituting society as such? A lot of liberal writers will want to say that there is something called the public, and everybody must cohere to the requirements of the public, namely respecting individual autonomy, self-determination, identity, authenticity, and so on, non-discrimination, because that is the rule of the public. Whereas what I'm saying is, well, no, what is public is constituted by the very actions of these groups. So we don't have something in advance. We have Roman Catholics, Muslims, Jewish, Hindu, Christian of different kind, various things that come together, and they are enacting what it means to form a public space. And in doing so, they bring to that table various forms of law and custom and rule and so on. So we already have that. That's already bubbling away there. I think that's just a way of how do we perceive it.
Who defines what is good? What is the good when two goods conflict?
Yeah, well, you're right. We have to have, so we are, when I talk in the book about a community of communities, right? So we have communities, but actually there is still a sense in which we are a community, and we must cohere and we must try and seek some form of harmony. And so when there is a real conflict, that does turn to, I think, hopefully our deliberative bodies, namely our parliaments. Sometimes it goes to courts. I think I've been emphasizing that maybe it's better it stays within deliberative bodies often. But, if we have a question over, for example, whether there is let's just take a strange example. There was a religious practice that was rife in our community, and we had a collective understanding that this is contrary to, fundamentally harmful to the dignity of persons, right? Then we may legislate. Now, that's why we get all these tension issues, right, over something like conversion therapy or over other questions around LGBT and so on, right? Because there's a contest over whether you can have an understanding there that, well, actually, people can pursue a good, but in different ways, right? Now, sometimes there may be an instance where, no, this is just ruled out entirely. And I would never want to rule, because we are a community that does stand for something collectively as well.
We're rapidly running out of time. Let me ask just a couple of questions to wind us up. We've got about 3 minutes left. But let's take the big overarching question. What difference could an Australian Human Rights Act make to the current situation? Do you think that's a desirable way to approach things? Have a debate over a Human Rights Act and find an overarching piece of legislation. Robert first.
The trouble is, where the Human Rights Act changed form of the debate, I suspect, but it would just a deal, in my view. It just might give more job for judges to make law rather than politicians, and maybe that's good, maybe that's bad. I don't think so. I think Joel's right. Is, in my view, it's a question of community. We want an Australia in which there is genuine respect for difference, and respect not just for difference in a nihilistic who cares, but respect for people's goal to seek the good, and I think that's crucial for our society. And a society that sneers, that belittles, that is disrespectful is a society which should become. And religious freedom is not about law. Ultimately, the law is important. It's about whether or not we're going to respect the right of those minorities in our society that believe, no doubt wrongly from others' point of views, that this is what the will of God is. And if we can't have that respect, I think we're in big trouble. So it's not human rights, it's about respect.
And that's conditional on those groups which people are associated with being voluntary associations. That is, they can opt out of that if they wish.
And absolutely, absolutely. And there is a responsibility. Groups that need respect, they need to come under the law. It's not a get out of jail free card, but I think it's needed. And the most respect for those who seem to most people the most weird, because they're the ones you most like to persecute.
Joel, your final words
on an Australian Human Rights Act.
Yes, and just generally, because we are almost out.
Yeah, sure. No, I think I've said, from what I've said tonight, I think you probably may guess that I don't think that's a good approach. I don't think it's a good approach for constitutional reasons as well. I don't like the allocation of that power to judges to decide what forms of ethical deliberation that I think should belong to the people themselves. And actually, there's quite a movement away from, or there's quite a movement of scholars that are quite critical of these charters, bills of rights, and so on now, both left and right. So, from the left, there's a good argument to say that often those bills of rights have actually been used in very conservative ways to protect property rights and things like this, while not actually doing any form of emancipatory action or egalitarian action, right? And from the right, often people talk about, well, this is just, riding roughshod over Parliament. Well, actually, everyone kind of agrees on that, right? That the place of ethical deliberation should be our representative institutions and so on. So there's a question there about judicial allocation to the judiciary of power that I think is problematic. And then when you look at it in the religious liberty context, look, the precedents from, say, Victoria, ACT, other Commonwealth jurisdictions, not great, right? It's not like it's been some sort of boon to religious liberty discourse. So I think that really what it goes back to, I guess, that point I made at the very beginning, that you're not going to have a vital understanding of the liberty of religious organizations, groups, and so on, unless you have a shared public commitment to religion being a good. And that's the difficulty. And as Rob has pointed out, it's a very difficult thing to try and promote because you're punting for the notion that people can enter into this understanding that there is such a thing as a religious quest, and it matters. And that's very difficult to persuade some people, but I think that's actually where you need to take it.
Dr. Joel Harrison, Bishop Robert Forsyth, thank you so much for joining us on this conversation. And it's now time to end tonight, and I'd call upon Affinity's Executive Director, Amit Pollitt, to present his closing remarks. Amit.
Thank you, Uncle John. Good evening, distinguished viewers, my newly extended families, uncles, aunties, cousins. What a wonderful conversation with a caliber of experts tonight. I'd like to sincerely thank our esteemed speakers of tonight for their insightful conversation, Bishop Rob Forsyth and Dr. Joel Harrison. Also, thank you to my esteemed Uncle John for successfully facilitating another Affinity webinar. Finally, thank you, Cousin Kathy Abla, for the warm welcoming, and as always, Cousin Matthew for assisting with the running of the program. As people of faith, we should aspire to be people of hope. This means that religion, at its highest, can have the power to dissolve borders. Religious freedom can act as a positive resource in the development of a plural and global society. As former United States President Barack Obama has said, religious freedom is a universal principle rooted in human dignity. Indeed, Australia is a richly diverse multicultural society and is becoming more pluralized and secular in its beliefs. It is important to learn how we all live together, in which many have a strong religious faith while others do not profess a religion. The important point is, how can freedom of religion be better protected under Australian law and all countries, and should be protected as separate principles in modern legal system as a basic human rights. Religious freedom can act as positive resources in the development of a plural and global society in which the exercise of religious freedom can take place in ways appropriate to a healthier relationship between the state and civil society, including the religious believers within it. It goes without saying that we live at a time where the importance of dialogue among people for the effective pursuit of peace is without parallel. Religious freedom, dialogue, understanding, and the widespread promotion of a culture of tolerance, acceptance of others, and living together peacefully will contribute significantly to reducing many economic, social, political, and environmental problems that weigh so heavily on a large part of humanity. Freedom of religion is thus vital to building a diverse and pluralist democratic world, including that of freedom of speech and assembly, and I believe Affinity has activated the yeast of this dialogue initiative and is on the path of trying to join hands with all humanity, where everyone lives in respect of harmony. Distinguished viewers, I would like to share with you Affinity's final webinar of the year. Affinity and Institute for Economics and Peace proudly present to you their fourth webinar episode, Global Terrorism Index Launch. Next Monday, Thomas Morgan and Dr. Gillian Drogon will discuss the comprehensive summary of the key global trends and patterns in terrorism found in the Global Terrorism Index. Finally, Affinity will have the pleasure of restreaming their previous webinar, the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, in mid-December. Unfortunately, we had to cancel this webinar due to technological issues beyond our hands' control. Stay updated by following Affinity on Facebook or Twitter. Thank you, dear listeners and supporters, and our distinguished speakers tonight, John, Robert, and Joel. I hope you have a lovely evening tonight. Thank you.